People get mad at me all the time when I say that statistics are overrated. Like, their minds explode. They can't handle it. Maybe they're a financial analyst and they're like, but you gotta. Please stop. We're talking about football. And I think it's really important for people to understand just how easily statistics can be misleading in the game of football. I heard someone say recently that, stats never lie. And I went, excuse me? He said, yeah, statistics, impossible. They never lie. And I'm like, are you kidding me? That's completely false. That's so false, I can't even believe it. I'm literally doing a topic on the podcast because of how wrong that is. Stats lie all the time, constantly. It's so easy for, stats to be misinterpreted or, misleading because you have to view them with context. You can't just take stats at face value. Now, I compiled a couple of examples. We're going to use XFL Week 5 as a kind of a case study to show some examples of where statistics can be incredibly misleading in the game of football. We'll start with, Houston's quarterback, PJ Walker's a big deal. People love him. We'll start with him. During Week 5, he had 3 turnovers. He had 2 interceptions and a fumble lost. That's 3 total turnovers against, they played Seattle this week. And the announcers kept saying, oh my gosh, he's got 3 turnovers. This is just a different PJ Walker than we've seen all season. And I just was like, you're wrong. It's not true. That statement saying we're just seeing a different PJ Walker was completely false. PJ Walker played exactly the same Week 5 as he did Week 4, Week 2, Week 3, Week 1. PJ Walker has played the same all 5 weeks of the XFL season. Now, he's a stud. I love him. He's going to be the league MVP. But occasionally, he makes a questionable throw. He'll make a throw where you go, ooh, that probably should have been intercepted. Against St. Louis and Tampa Bay, weeks 2 and 3. PJ Walker gave the defense opportunities, and they dropped interceptions. There's a couple plays burned into my memory because I remember writing them down going, oh, let's not forget that. Where the defense had the ball in their hands, PJ Walker threw it right to him, and they dropped the ball. That should have been an interception that in the stat line did not go down as an interception. But people, if you just look at, if the only way you analyze PJ Walker and you go, well, in the first 5 weeks, I looked at his highlights, and his highlights aren't going to have turnovers. And then you look at his box score, and you go, well, he had no turnovers week 2 and 3, so, well, clearly we're just seeing a different quarterback week 5 than we've seen all year. That's where that quote comes from, and it's because people don't dig deeper. They just take the stats at face value. They only read the box score. They only watch the highlights rather than looking at the full context of the game and seeing, oh, he's made mistakes like that all season. Just week 5, the defense happened to actually catch the ball. Now, another interesting part of PJ Walker's game is his ability to run around. And week 5, he ran the ball 7 times for -5 yards. 7 rushes for -5 yards. What happened? His running game was shut down because Seattle ran a really wide, disciplined pass rush. It's a really good scheme designed by Seattle in this game, and they designed it to keep PJ Walker in the pocket. Their aim was, the defensive ends are going to pass rush really wide, get really wide, keep PJ Walker in front of you. No matter where he goes, keep your eyes on him, keep him in front of you. Don't let him get behind you. And if you keep him in front of you, he'll stay in the pocket. If he tries to run around, we can tackle him. And that's exactly what happened. Seattle did a great job containing PJ Walker, and it's because they made a different adjustment. Rather than just rushing upfield, blindly trying to sack PJ Walker, they played a type of contained defense, kept PJ Walker in front of them, didn't let him run around and escape the pocket. So in week 5, PJ Walker had 3 turnovers. He ran the ball 7 times for -5 yards. And the question is, did PJ Walker change? No. No, he did not. The defense changed. The defense made adjustments, and they made plays when PJ Walker threw the ball in their hands. They caught interceptions. PJ Walker hasn't changed. The defense did week 5. How about poor Phillip Nelson? Phillip Nelson is Dallas's backup quarterback. He had 2 interceptions in week 5. And if you just look at the stat sheet, it's terrible. You go, oh my gosh, Phillip Nelson, 2 interceptions, must have made 2 terrible decisions. But here's the reality. They were plays where he just got unlucky. They were not bad decisions. He threw the ball got tipped up in the air and caught by defensive linemen. Both of his interceptions week 5 were caught by defensive linemen. Is that a bad decision or is that just being unlucky? Phillip Nelson was unlucky. Those interceptions are not a reflection of his decision making. And then Luis Perez, my favorite storyline in this case study of stats being misleading. New York's quarterback Luis Perez in week 5 was 16 for 30 passing. That's a 53% completion percentage. And completion percentage is something, we'll get into it. It's so overrated. It's so silly. They're like, we put so much emphasis on completion percentage. So he had a 53% completion percentage, 229 yards passing, 1 touchdown, 1 interception. And he was yet nearly perfect, even though the stats wouldn't show that. Luis Perez made phenomenal decisions the entire game, and yet the stat line would say, oh, well, 53% completion percentage, that's terrible. So why was his completion percentage so low, and why did he have so many incompletions? There are 2 reasons. Number 1 was that he kept throwing the ball away. He did it either to avoid a sack or because, nobody was open and he was avoiding a negative play. I'm going to throw the ball into the stands rather than force it into coverage. And people want things to be simple because nuance is confusing. Fair enough. I guess I don't really understand it, but whatever, that's people. People just want it to be black and white. Incompletions are bad. That's what most people believe. Incompletion equals bad play. Bad quarterback, incompletion. But there is such a thing as a good incompletion. Luis Perez's incompletions were actually good decisions where he was throwing the ball to avoid a negative play, throwing the ball into the stands, or throwing the ball away to avoid a sack, or avoid forcing the ball into coverage. That's a good decision, even though, it's a, quote, a bad incompletion. But another thing you have to pay attention to is that New York had 6 or 7 dropped passes. I mean, Mikhail McKay had the ball in his hands wide open, just dropped it. And that happened multiple times down the stretch for New York in week 5. Is a dropped pass a brilliant, a great read, a great throw, hit your receiver right in stride in the hands that's dropped? That's not the quarterback's fault. And yet the statistics would reflect, that's an incompletion that makes the quarterback look bad. So the incompletions were not the quarterback's fault, at least not the dropped passes, and neither was his interception. Mikhail McKay tried to one-hand a back shoulder fade, tried to one-hand it, the ball kind of rolled off his hands, got popped into the air, right into the hands of a waiting defender. That's not Luis Perez's fault. That's a really good throw that Mikhail McKay botched, tipped up in the air, and allowed the defense to make a play on it. That interception was not Luis Perez's fault. It was the receiver's fault, not the quarterback's. So stats lie all the time. Especially in the game of football, they can be incredibly misleading. Do not put all your faith into statistics. It drives me nuts. Especially if you avoid context. Oh my gosh. Stats are kind of like Spark Notes. Spark Notes can give you the gist of a story. But to fully understand what happened in a book, you need to read the whole book. You need to read the whole story. You can't just read the Spark Notes. Stats are, again, like a Spark Notes, they're a shortcut. You need the full context to fully understand stats. You can't just look at a box score and some highlights and think you know the whole story of a game and the whole story of a player. And let's be very honest, some stats are meaningless. There's an Instagram account called WTF Stats. They just give you a lot of stats that are like, I like the account, by the way. There's a really cool picture of the Atlanta FC Stadium. It's like in the Atlanta Dome, whatever, the Georgia Dome, I guess is what it's called. And they have like 71,000 people. And I guess all 10 of the highest attended MLS games in MLS history are games in Atlanta. Does that have any value? I mean, I don't know. Someone could find probably a commercial value to say that, hey, you want to do marketing at a Atlanta game. But what does that have to do with soccer? Not a lot. Just not much. So stats lie all the time. You cannot just blindly trust numbers. Stats can be incredibly misleading if you refuse to pay attention to the context. Stats are not the story. Don't just SparkNote a game. Don't just look at the stats. Don't just watch the highlights. If you want to really understand the gist of a game and talk with authority, watch the film. Watch an entire game. Don't just throw out a couple stats and think you're a gigantic expert on exactly what happened in a football game.